You know, there's something quite peculiar that happens when a person begins to wake up spiritually. And by waking up, I don't mean having some grand mystical experience or achieving enlightenment in the way people often imagine it, as if you suddenly become bathed in golden light and all your problems disappear. No, what I'm talking about is something far more subtle, and in many ways far more troubling. I'm talking about the moment when you begin to see through the game, when the veil starts to lift, when you recognize that so much of what you've been told is real and important is actually nothing more than an elaborate fiction. And here's what nobody warns you about. Once you see through it, you can't unsee it. There are things you lose in this process of awakening that you can never get back. Not because they've been taken from you, but because they simply dissolve once you recognize them for what they always were. Illusions, games, agreed upon fantasies that only work as long as everyone pretends they're real. The first thing you lose, and perhaps the most disorienting, is your ability to take the social game seriously. Now, I don't mean you become rude or inconsiderate. What I mean is that you can no longer participate in the theater of social posturing with the same earnest investment you once had. You see people maneuvering for status, competing for recognition, carefully constructing their images, and you can see right through it. You see it as a kind of dance, a ritual that everyone has agreed to perform, and the spell is broken. Before awakening, you were probably a willing participant in this dance. You cared about your reputation, your social standing, what people thought of you. You played the game because everyone else was playing it, and it seemed like the most natural thing in the world. But once you wake up, you see the game as a game. And here's the thing about games. Once you recognize them as games, they lose their power over you. You might still play, but you're no longer fooled into thinking the game is reality itself. I remember watching people at social gatherings after I had begun to see through this particular illusion. The conversations about who had achieved what, who knew whom, who had been recognized or promoted or honored, all of it appeared to me like children playing at being grown-ups, taking their make-believe terribly seriously. And I don't say this with any sense of superiority, mind you. I'm not suggesting I was better than these people. I'm simply describing what happens when you see through the game. You lose your ability to care about it in the way you once did. And this loss has consequences. Your old friends may find you strange now. They sense that you're not playing by the same rules anymore, that you're not impressed by the things that impress them, that you don't share their concerns about status and position. They may accuse you of having changed, of having become aloof or arrogant, but you haven't become arrogant. You've simply stopped pretending that the emperor is wearing clothes when you can clearly see he's naked. The second thing you lose is your innocence about human motivation. Before awakening, you probably took people at face value. When someone said something, you generally believed they meant it. When someone acted friendly, you assumed they were friendly. When someone claimed to believe in something, you thought they actually believed it. But as you wake up, you begin to see the layers beneath the surface. You see how much of what people say and do is driven by fear, by the desperate need for approval, by unconscious patterns they're completely unaware of. You start to notice the gap between what people claim to value and how they actually behave. You see someone speak eloquently about compassion and kindness, and then you watch them treat a waiter with contempt. You hear people declare their commitment to truth and honesty, and then you observe them lying to themselves with every breath. You notice how people construct elaborate justifications for doing exactly what they wanted to do anyway. This seeing is not comfortable. In fact, it can be quite painful, because you also start to see these patterns in yourself. You recognize how much of your own behavior has been driven by unconscious fear and need. You catch yourself in the act of self-deception. You notice how often your noble-sounding reasons for doing things are really just cover stories for much more basic drives. The desire to be liked, to feel safe, to avoid discomfort. Once you've seen this, you can't unsee it. And this means you lose a certain kind of trust in human nature, or perhaps more accurately, a certain naivety about it. You become, in a sense, impossible to fool. Not because you've become cynical. Cynicism is just another form of belief. after all, but because you've developed a kind of X-ray vision for pretense and self-deception. The third thing you lose, and this is perhaps the most profound, is your belief in the continuity and solidity of your own self. Before awakening, you probably experienced yourself as a continuous entity moving through time, the same person you were yesterday, the same person you'll be tomorrow, with a consistent set of characteristics, preferences, and qualities that define who you are. But as you begin to wake up, this sense of a solid, continuous self starts to dissolve. You notice that what you call yourself is really just a collection of thoughts, memories, sensations, and patterns that are constantly changing. You catch yourself being different people in different situations, not because you're being false, but because there is no fixed person to be true to. The self you thought was so real and permanent turns out to be more like a river than a rock, always flowing, never the same from one moment to the next. This is extraordinarily disorienting, because if there's no solid self, then who is living your life? Who is making your decisions? Who is experiencing your experiences? The mind rebels against this recognition. It desperately wants to believe in the reality of the self, because without that belief, everything becomes uncertain. If there's no solid me, then what's the point of anything? Why should I care about what happens to this body and mind if there's no real person here anyway? But here's what's interesting. Once you lose your belief in the solid self, you can't get it back even if you want to. You might try to convince yourself that you're a real, solid person again, but you've seen through it. You know it's just another story, another convenient fiction. And this knowing changes everything, because so much of human suffering is based on the desperate attempt to protect and promote a self that doesn't actually exist in the way we think it does. The fourth thing you lose is your ability to believe in the ultimate importance of your own story. Every human being constructs a narrative about their life, where they came from, what happened to them, what it all means, where they're going. This narrative gives life a sense of coherence and purpose. It turns the random events of existence into a meaningful story with heroes and villains, triumphs and tragedies, lessons learned and wisdom gained. Before awakening, your story was probably very important to you. It defined you. It explained you. It justified you. When people asked who you were, you told them your story. When you thought about yourself, you rehearsed your story. The story gave meaning to your suffering and significance to your achievements. But as you wake up, you begin to see your story as just that, a story, a narrative constructed after the fact to make sense of what happened. And you realize that you could tell the same events in a completely different way and create an entirely different story. The facts remain the same, but the meaning changes depending on how you frame them. What you once saw as your greatest triumph might be reinterpreted as your greatest folly. What you thought was your